My name is Bill Regli. It's a pleasure to be the chair of this session about DARPA and academia and how DARPA and universities work together and partner. DARPA's had a long and deep relationship with academia in the United States, and American higher educational institutions are an essential part of the research ecosystem where the ideas that the DARPA program managers are hatching come to fruition. And the agency's provided generations of scientists and engineers, myself being one of them, with opportunities to learn and become part of these problems related to national security. And one of the goals of this panel is to discuss some of the issues, challenges, and emerging, I don't want to say problems, because they're not problems. They're just the culture is changing. There are new topics and problems in national security that require universities adapt a little bit. And the panel we've assembled hopefully we'll talk about some of those issues and some of the way forward. So the hope is that this panel will share its insights, put a few ideas into action, and maybe foment some discussion about the partnership between DARPA and academia, how important this relationship has become, especially as the threats to our society become more diverse, more complex and sophisticated, and then generate some ideas of how we can work together. So our panel consists of all DARPA alumni, and in preparing for the panel, we converged on a desire to essentially tell a few stories. Each of us give one or two concrete examples of lessons learned from our various institutions and how we might put them into action. So I'll just want to introduce each of the people in turn. Their biographies are detailed in the program as well as in the online app. But Steve Kraus, recently retired Executive Vice President at Georgia Tech Research Corporation, DARPA Program Manager in the strategic computing era, and he led the development of a number of programs and initiatives at Georgia Tech to bring use-inspired research into the campus environment. John Montford, a program manager in the, now John Montford was going to be here, I'm sorry. Oh, forgive me, long week. This is a long week. So let's reboot here. Alan Rudolph, excuse me. Currently, yeah, it was a last-minute switch. We had John Montford's also a DARPA alum, and he's was the Vice Provost of Research at the University of Texas. Texas A&M. He took a new position, couldn't be here today. So Alan Rudolph graciously agreed to step in. He is at Colorado State University, the Vice President for Research there. He was responsible for a number of programs at DARPA in the turn of the century era, looking at the beginning of the biology and neuro revolution in the Defense Science Office. And Stefanie Tompkins, who I had the honor and pleasure of serving with for my tour at DARPA. Stefanie had essentially every role at DARPA except that of the director, office director, deputy director of the agency, and now she is the Vice President for Research at the Colorado School of Mines. So with that, I'd like to get right to it and have each of us talk a little bit in turn. I'll kind of close it, and then hopefully we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. So with that, I'd like Steve to come up and tell us your story.
Very good.
Sorry about that.
I see some friends in the audience, and they'll keep me honest, I'm sure, so I'll have to tell the truth here today. In the early 1980s, I was an Air Force officer who was asked to go back and work on his doctorate, and I thought this area of artificial intelligence was coming and pretty exciting, so that's what I decided to study. And there were two seminal events that happened in my first year of PhD studies, which I didn't know that would really set the course of the rest of my life. The first was a paper that was in AI magazine by Bob Engelmore. Bob was a researcher at Stanford, and he published a short paper as he became the editor of that magazine about his experience at DARPA as a program manager. And it was at that point that I decided I wanted to go to DARPA. The second event was a couple years later. Bob Cooper, who was then the director of DARPA, gave a talk about a new program that was going to be created called strategic computing. And that really excited me in terms of my engineering background. Kind of the characteristics of that program was it was research in advanced computing, networking, artificial intelligence, but motivated by grand challenge problems. So this whole idea of use-inspired research was something that was introduced to me. And then the systems engineering kind of approach of decomposing these problems into requirements that couldn't be met with existing technology and using those as motivation where the investment should go for research. So when I did become a DARPA program manager in 1989, I decided to use those two ideas in my programs, which had to do with planning and scheduling, and some of these were mentioned in an AI session yesterday. And I won't talk a lot about those programs, but it was just beginning of Operation Desert Storm, and we had some successes that were quite successful, using some of the military planning problems and the real-time nature of that as a grand challenge problem. But there were 5 kind of key lessons learned from my programs, which went from a period of time from 1989 to 1984 that I brought into the university when I came into my role. And these lessons are as follows, which I think were true in my DARPA programs. One was to have the trust of the principal investigators and to create a community of principal investigators who would work together. This is always described to me as creating a critical mass community. I think trust for PIs is a little bit easier to build when you're a DARPA program manager because you can substitute budget for trust. But it's a little bit easier to get people to cooperate together. The next thing we did in my programs is we had a shared infrastructure and stressed an experimental approach. And I had a systems integrator who was there to make sure that we had near-term applications that the military would be interested in, but could also support the rest of the PIs in their research. Because one of the problems we had in AI is we didn't have access to real large data sets. So having a large data set and then having people work on the same problem was very important. Third point that was really important was having a subject matter expert who was respected in the military community, but that actually adopted the vision in our programs. And this was a surrogate who could actually speak the language in the military that most of us in the DARPA community couldn't speak. And fourth thing was having access to senior leadership, to admirals and generals who would actually appreciate what you're trying to do for a vision that they were trying to accomplish. And the last thing was in the program itself, having a portfolio that was balanced so that there were near-term outcomes that actually benefited the warfighter, but were stepping stones to the longer-term vision. So after a great stint at Carnegie Mellon University, where I worked with Chuck Thorpe and other people, I had a chance to come to Georgia Tech in 2003 and was kind of given permission to implement these ideas. And I won't spend a lot of time talking about, but the past 8 years have been sort of transformational at Georgia Tech. Both Carnegie Mellon and Georgia Tech have a culture of interdisciplinarity, and that was really good for all of this. They also have a culture of problem solving real-world problems. So introducing a use-inspired research approach and expecting interdisciplinary support from faculty wasn't too hard. But these 5 principles I talked about were a little difficult to implement. One was getting trust of faculty. I'm not a DARPA program manager anymore, so I don't have the budget authority that I once had. So it's a little difficult to get the trust with faculty. And it took about 4 years to do that in terms of introducing grand challenge problems and introducing a more experimental approach, introducing a more team-based approach. The second principle we had was then shared equipment, shared data sets, more experimentation approach. And that was implemented over time. Rather than having subject matter experts in the application domain, I kind of switched that. And I had relationship managers, faculty members who really understood the domain problems where our grand challenges were, who would come back and serve the faculty, would bring problems to the faculty that they were uniquely qualified to address. And over time, this helped build the faculty trust because we were reducing administrative burden and creating opportunities for faculty. One of the tasks that I was given at Georgia Tech was to grow our industry impact and our industry volume of research. And then having the connections with the senior leaders in companies was very important. And to be able to actually keep them interested, we'd have to have a balanced portfolio, near-term outcomes that were of interest to the company, senior executives who saw a vision of where they could go in their market, and those would be stepping stones to that market. So some of the outcomes we had were really pretty exciting. We had 27 major corporations that established innovation centers at Georgia Tech since the year 2012. We've grown our industry volume of research 16% a year for the past 3 years. We closed at $126 million in the past year. And we saw about a 7-fold increase in the number of startups because we started building accelerators that were in the markets these large companies were in, and it turned out these companies started investing in the small companies. So that was just a kind of a snowball effect and good things that happened. So I've probably taken too much time, but these 5 lessons learned, having the trust of the faculty, we're the principal investigators at DARPA, having investment in shared infrastructure and data sets built, motivated by grand challenges that were very important to some end user you're trying to impact, having surrogates who are respected in the application domain and connections with the senior leadership, and then having a balanced portfolio of outcomes in the program are what made all the difference. Probably was maybe a little easier to do at Georgia Tech because of 2 things we had. One was the Georgia Tech Research Institute, which is really focused on large-scale prototyping and application. And most of its work is in the national security sector. So I could tell you stories, if there were time, about how we did these grand challenges and innovation in the national security sector. Second thing is we had a statewide focus on economic development with a support structure that supported industry. And that was very helpful as well. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thanks.
There'll be time for Q&A and discussion afterwards. So now I'd like to introduce Alan to come up.
Thank you. I'm going to stay here and just speak from the platform here, if that's okay. So I wanted to focus my comments a little bit. I'm a rather young academic, not age-wise, but I've only been in the academy for 5 years. I came from Naval Research Lab. Just to give you a little perspective of my comments. Before coming to DARPA, I was a decade at the Naval Research Lab. I was the only zoologist at NRL, and then I came to DARPA. I was the only zoologist until more recently at DARPA. And then I became a biotech entrepreneur. So I was 7 or 8 years carrying water up a hill and raising money, but working in the biotech entrepreneur space. Came back to run something big and broken in government, and then left in 2013 for Colorado State University as vice president of research. So really, that I think in a thumbnail gives you hopefully some perspectives of what I'd like to speak about today. And really what I wanted to focus on is maybe a little bit of lessons learned as we were asked to share, but also as an emerging opportunity where the academies and DARPA have worked together, but I think opportunities to both learn from each other and programmatically look at emerging opportunities is in the social sciences. The social science area is historic for the academies, and I'll talk a little bit about how that relates to the kind of university I'm in, which is a land-grant university. I'll mention that in a little while. But I think, as you heard Steve Walker open the conference, and DSO, I think, has the only social scientist at DARPA, Adam Russell. I think it's something that DARPA has been interested in, recognizes, and I think the Academy has a lot to offer. So I want to talk about that in sort of a two-way kind of conversation through my experiences. So, the crossing of the valley of death that we often refer to and is referred to at DARPA in terms of taking an idea, reducing it to practice, and managing that risk. At the end of one's tenure at DARPA, the question about who cares comes up, especially if you're in the Defense Sciences Office where you're investing in perhaps the most high risk, the most fundamental science that you're trying to reduce to practice, where the academic community is highly engaged. For the military environment, the who cares is often about finding a military transition partner or an acquisition partner. But in the valley of death, this issue about who cares is really a social science issue. It's a social science question about adoptive practices. Why does somebody change and take on innovation? And I think that's an interesting question worth some further comment on, both in terms of experiences at DARPA and now in the Academy. Let me start with probably a bit of an angle on this that is, I think, appreciated within DARPA and was mentioned previously. DARPA is very much, although there's no sort of standard operating procedure, about building teams. And team performance is something that is also a social science issue. In my case, being a zoologist, I had to bring in disciplines not usual to DARPA. Insect biologists, neuroscientists, behaviorists, and really put together teams that could pursue the programs we were interested in pursuing. And we tended to focus those teams on milestones, and we made decisions based on whether those teams hit milestones or not. What has been going on in the social science community, mostly in the business fields, but there's been a resurgence of the science of team science. And in the academies, NIH is funding more of this. So we, on our campus, and I've seen this now there's actually a Society of Science of Team Science. They're having meetings. I think this is a rich area for some examination. And I realized, looking back at my DARPA experience, that we were in fact running small social science experiments with these teams, because the team performance isn't always about how an idea gets reduced to practice. It's about who's leading the team, how are they working together, how can one monitor that in a more formative way in order to predict team performance, not just to see an idea reduced, but to see that the team is functioning in the most productive way. There are new tools to do this, and the goodness about what DSO is doing now in the social sciences is really working on methodologies to how to make social science more rigorous. And yet, I think there's going to be a turning point, and we're seeing this inside the academy, where you'd like to be able to apply those methods and be able to predict team performance. So I've taken the lessons learned somewhat observationally inside our university, and there are others who are doing this, and have created a small DARPA-like program. It's a proactive management program. It sets stage gates. So, I think some of the young faculty are already more engaged around some of the DARPA ways of doing business. And we've actually started to longitudinally monitor these teams in formative ways that allows us to predict their performance more efficiently. And I think this is a rich area. I don't know how many program managers do this in DARPA, but I think as your professors start to interact with DARPA, this is something that could be on the horizon with regard to looking at social sciences and actually turning them inward to understand, when we put teams together to perform, how do they perform? And there are very interesting aspects to this. We've looked at the role of women on these teams. Clearly, diversity is an important aspect. All of our campuses are focused on diversity now in terms of how we build that on our campuses. And I think this is a rich palette for DARPA to understand what's being done in the academy, and for the academy to learn from DARPA as they get on these teams. The second point about social science, and I come from a land-grant university where in the Morrill Act in the late 1800s, Lincoln traded land to create the state universities. They were called agricultural and mechanics universities, A&Ms. Now many of them changed their names. Texas still keeps the A&M. Thank you, John Mockford. And what is interesting about that is it is the country's first tech transfer system. Having a person in every county of every state allows for the transfer of information and the flow of information, if not that social, cultural, adoptive practice, to be worked on more actively. And I think it's a very good analogy to the defense system of T&E, testing and evaluation, and perhaps an underutilized channel system for DARPA, who thinks about military testing, but often could use the system of these kinds of extension agents and these channels of tech transfer that many universities across the country have. And so that was another comment I wanted to make in terms of lessons learned of how do you take an idea now reduced to practice, scale it in the context of starting to work on perhaps that hardest challenge of who cares. The last point I want to make is an emerging opportunity that I really feel is a crisis that is not spoken well of, or in the context that we really need to address this. And this is the mental health crisis that occurs on our campuses and occurs in the DoD population of 18 to 25-year-olds. We've had a number of suicides. We have suicides every year on our campus. We look at the population of 18 to 25-year-olds who are in dormitories, who have stresses around exams. It's very similar to the defense population. And I think this is an area of opportunity for the Department of Defense and DARPA, who is clearly interested in these things from the neuroscience point of view. But when they start to look at social science applications, and they already are within DARPA, I think the area where we have a lot of commonality is in dealing with this very young population and the crises that are occurring on all of our campuses. Very similar in demographics, very similar in the stressors, and very similar actually in the footprint by which these young people live. I think this is a rich opportunity for the academies to step in and help and work together on some very formative programs to address this crisis in both of our institutions. Thank you.
Terrific. Stefanie, would you like to share some of your insights from your time at DARPA and now, recently, at Colorado Mines?
Well, I don't know if it was planned this way, but there's sort of a gradient here. Bill didn't really talk a lot about his own history, but he has a very long career in academia, and he brought a lot of insight to DARPA about the other side. And then Steve has less time, but significantly more than Alan or me. Alan talks about being young to the academy. I have 7 months, okay? So you won't be surprised if I'm going to talk a little bit more from the DARPA perspective, but to give you a little of my background, I am a geologist by training. Joined the Army immediately after college because that was how I paid for going to college in the first place. And then when I went to graduate school, I ended up focusing on a fairly obscure field, the field of lunar geology. I learned how to map minerals on the moon, and then came into the DoD world soon after that. And so I really spent a lot of my time trying to think about how fairly obscure areas of expertise apply to national defense programs or questions of interest. And it turns out the opportunities are everywhere. So I think what I really wanted to talk about was how you sort of think about the kinds of things that are happening in your universities and how they might be sort of, just tilted a little bit and think about how they might intersect with the needs of national security and with an organization like DARPA. So let me at least sort of get a sense of the audience. How many of you have never worked with DARPA before? Okay, so there are a few, right? I think I really, really want to appeal to all of you. DARPA absolutely needs universities. We need, they need that field of new ideas that are constantly bubbling over, people who are exploring new things, whether they have, a clear application or not. But the universities also act as sort of this channel for moving from that space to, as my fellow panelists have mentioned, the use-inspired research, where people start to think about how a new discovery in a lab might start to apply to an interesting problem. And so regardless of what fields you are in, I actually come from a university that has no medical, almost no biological, and no social science. It's all engineering. There are some really fascinating opportunities if you take some time to kind of lift up the covers and poke around to help see those intersections between what your faculty and what you're working on and national security. So an example at Mines is that it turns out that we have one of the world's foremost underground construction and tunneling programs tied to a combination of civil engineering and mining engineering. And it had never occurred to me until I started talking to some of our faculty members there that people who build tunnels and underground infrastructures probably have a completely different thought process on how to find tunnels and underground infrastructures, which is a huge national security question. And the kinds of insights that they've offered up just from their thought process about how to minimize construction costs and how to deal with safety issues and things like that have led to all kinds of sort of perceptions and clues about what people might be looking for if they're trying to detect them. Similarly, we have a lot of people who drill into the ground. And it turns out that the kinds of materials that you need for drilling at very, very high temperatures overlap heavily with the same questions that the hypersonics people have been asking about electronics and materials that can survive at very, very high temperatures in extreme environments. So these are just examples. The intersections are everywhere. If you're listening to the talks that have been going on throughout this conference, you're getting a sense of what the concerns are, what keep the DARPA program managers up at night and what they're worrying about. And what I sort of implore you to do is think about your own research or think about your colleagues' research and look for ways to sort of twist that kaleidoscope just a little bit and figure out how to make that matching up. So the other thing I will say, there's a huge overlap with the trend in academia in grand challenges. DARPA has specialized in grand challenges pretty much from inception and from throwing out crazy goals that people are convinced are impossible to meet and suddenly realizing that with enough money and a really well-framed question, the impossible can be made possible. And so the other thing that I will sort of throw out to you is that part of your job for your own research or for your colleagues' research is to help figure out how to start that dialogue back and forth between your institutions and the sort of the national security field, and particularly with DARPA, on how to ask those grand challenge questions, right? There is no magic formula. It's a little bit of, hey, we have this new discovery, we think maybe it could be used for this, or there's a DARPA program manager who says, here's this unbelievably hard problem I have to solve, and I want to solve it this way, and you start that conversation going back and forth, and each side gives a little bit, and suddenly you get to that sort of perfectly formed question that suddenly inspires the whole world. Those folks who have gone to the neuroscience Europanel's already happened? All right, Jeff Ling was on the panel. Alan is very, very modest. He actually did a lot of the original work and funded most of the work that started a whole trend that led to a question that said, if soldiers lose their arms, could play the piano before they lost a limb on the battlefield, they should be able to play the piano afterwards. One of the most elegant questions I've ever heard in my life that inspired a generation of roboticists and neuroscientists and sensor device people to come together to sort of change our entire world of possibilities. Help us at the universities ask those questions, help the DARPA program managers ask those questions. Lots and lots of tips and tricks to be found on how you do that, and those might come out in the questions. But I think I just wanted to kind of leave you with that. And where there's a barrier to entry, where you feel like you don't know how to get people to come think about these problems, use some of those insights. You don't have to become a national security expert. You just have to think a little bit about what you're already doing, what you do really well, and how it might serve the greater good. So that's it.
Terrific. All right, let's see how my voice holds out. I had two practical points I wanted to add to the mix. When I arrived at DARPA in 2014, one of the things I undertook along with Stefanie was outreach to college campuses around the United States to let people know what the opportunities were like at DARPA and try and engage people. And invariably, I'd get the same question at each place, which was, how do I get DARPA to fund my grant? Some individual faculty member would put their hand up, and how do you get you to fund my grant? And I'd say, well, the program managers have problems that they're working on. What they want is your expertise to help solve their problem. And what was more complicated was, when I would talk about the kinds of problems that were keeping our program managers up at night, a lot of them weren't in neatly defined academic disciplines. And I reflected on, years ago, I'd read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was the, philosophy of science about the discourse of scientific endeavor. And what happens in academic communities, we can kind of get locked into the reward system, publishing. I got to publish in a certain place. So the only problems you look for are essentially the ones under the lamppost, right? I'm looking for the problems that I know I can get published in a certain spot. Therefore, I sort of limit my discourse to what my community will accept. And at DARPA, the problems were, maybe not inside the box. They're in these spaces between the lampposts. So how do you get faculty at one level to think about these issues? And that becomes a question of what I think of as impact. How do I help faculty find problems where they can have impact in a different way? Impact in doing systems-oriented work, where maybe the transition is part of the impact. Impact where the result might be a commercial product. Impact in a way where maybe it's getting to a warfighter or somebody else who can use it, instead of simply their next paper or their next conference. But to do that requires thinking differently. So one of the things I'm trying to do at College Park is deploy within my institute some ideation activities, the kind of things we did at DARPA to develop programs on our own, and have faculty come with their ideas, but step back and look at a problem, and then bring their science to the problems. Essentially, instead of grand challenges maybe imposed bottom up, bring the problems in and then find ways to respond to them, as opposed to just manufacturing the ones under the lampposts, if you will. The second point is that for faculty to work on problems for national security, the tempo is not something in alignment with university cycles, right? Faculty tend to think in terms of graduate student years. I'm trying to get somebody their PhD. It's going to take 3-4 years. Their ideal framework is a 4 or 5 year grant where I hire the student, produce the PhD, and then you ask for a report in year 5. Unfortunately, national security problems don't work that way. I remember vividly my first month at DARPA, we were responding to the Ebola crisis, and money was coming in to have stuff happen because there was immediate cause for alarm that certain countries in Africa might fail as countries if this got into the urban environments. So for faculty to respond to that, there's a message I would try to give to university administrators that you actually have to provide a buffer of some sort. You have to provide some incentives and some top cover to faculty who are willing to take a risk in their career and work on these kinds of problems. Because you know what? It's going to be fast. It's going to be all-consuming. It might not line up neatly with the academic calendar. And faculty who haven't experienced that before, might find that hard. So one of our challenges in the university environment, I think, is to find those cohorts of faculty and educate them to how to engage, and then provide them the infrastructure so they're not like doing a high wire act, because if the funding goes away or the crisis, vanishes and then suddenly, we don't need your effort, well, you don't want the student or the faculty member, left hanging out there. What I found at DARPA is we were sympathetic to those issues, but the faculty themselves were the ones who we wanted them to meet us halfway, and we weren't getting the message out and showing them how to do it. So one place where those of you at universities could be a huge help to the national security concerns of the country is finding those cohorts of faculty and then providing them that scaffolding and support needed to work on these kinds of problems, understanding that the tempo is very different from certain other government agencies that fund science. So those are the 2 points I wanted to have about incentives and impact, and then also about the temporal aspect and the timescales. So with that, I'd like to actually open the floor up, or the app up, for questions. The group isn't so big that we couldn't take them from the floor, but if folks want to use the app, you can post some questions. We have some stuff preloaded. Anybody want to add anything to the discussion based on what we've said already?
The one thing I would add is you were speaking, Bill, to the administrators. I know there are faculty in the room directly, so for your perspective, think about what your administration needs to do to make it easier for you. You've actually got the ground eye view of what some of these mismatches are. That's a huge point. Right. And ask for the help. Because a lot of times it just never occurs on the administrative side, for folks to even know what you're struggling with. So, be vocal and ask DARPA to maybe help, suggest how you can frame that question back to your own institutions.
So let's field one from the app here. So maybe some lessons learned. I'll steer this one to Steve. What were, aside from money, in your experience, you looked at the faculty at Georgia Tech. What were some of the things that got faculty excited to work with GTRI or work on a national security problem?
And probably our best example is in cybersecurity right now. One of our largest DARPA grants that was mentioned in briefing this morning, and I can't talk a lot about it, but it involves about 50 people at GTRI who help maintain a humongous database of malware, about 300 million instances of malware that's been collected. And that database is used in research in electrical computer engineering in our College of Computing. And so we have this really good team and trust between soft money research faculty at GTRI and academic faculty and graduate students in the colleges. Now, that came about really through the faculty wanting to scale and solve an important problem, but the real critical thing was leadership. We were able to put in place an academic faculty member and a GTRI faculty member who saw that the opportunity was to do something greater than what they could do with their own 4 graduate students. That their leadership was dependent on creating opportunities for other faculty and convincing that faculty to work together as a community and as a team. And that's sort of a foreign concept in my experience in universities, but it worked out very well there. So the things that really incentivized the faculty, and one of the success inside of Georgia Tech was the time I spent mentoring younger faculty members. These are usually full professors and For instance, somebody young now is somebody who's in their 40s to me. So, so somebody who's been a faculty member for about 20 years, but they're now coming into a position where they're really thinking about leadership for the first time and how they can actually bring people in from many different departments to work on a hard problem. So a lot of my time was spent on mentoring these people who in turn were able to articulate the grand challenge problems to the different sponsors, both in the national security sector and in many of the industry markets that we worked in, and then coalesce a team of people who were focused on fundamental research as well as people who were focused on translational and prototyping. And that was probably babbling on too much about
great.
that. But the role of leadership is really important in cultivating leaders within the university that are capable of doing this. I think that's consistent with many things Stefanie said about the first time you work with DARPA. So.
Let me steer one to Alan. So right now there are many issues in the news, in the political sphere about research funding work that then gets exported overseas in various ways. There are people that might say that DARPA has rules and maybe that infringes on my academic freedom if I'm going to limit publications. So how can universities respond in this environment where we're concerned about the intellectual property we developed maybe being used by other nations? How do we keep the academic freedoms but still protect the stuff that we need to protect?
One of the roles that, turn this back on, sorry. So one of the roles that Stefanie and I play as VPRs of universities is in the compliance functions, which actually are, in our case, when we do have biology and we have human and animal experimentation, are getting more and more onerous. So export control actually is a big deal right now on campuses, especially with the situation in terms of Weiwu University, or did I say that right? But there are issues around China, and many of our campuses have increased our tuition revenues by bringing in students from around the world. So this actually is getting to be a much more serious issue for for the academies, and one which we're paying more attention to and trying to keep up with. In our case, we actually have quite a bit of biosecurity assets around infectious diseases. Traditionally, we've been strong in as many of the universities, but post-Amerithrax, and DARPA was very early in the biodefense game, and so we've created a lot of assets in the university that were created post-Amerithrax for surge capacity. And yet we haven't really sustained those because luckily we haven't seen the kind of outbreaks. But we have some things on the horizon that are really important. So for example, they closed Plum Island and are bringing all the foreign animal disease work to Manhattan, Kansas. And the country's now establishing what is essentially a regional stockpile for veterinary and animal diseases, because one foot and mouth disease case will close the beef market for 6 months to about $65 billion. So we have really important national security problems. We have a very diverse international student body. We have a lot of intellectual property being created, and really the only governor on this from our position is export control. And it's a bit of a challenge, and one that it's really hard to meet inside this large world of compliance. So I don't really have a good answer for you. I mean, it's something that's much more on our radar. We're adding resources and people to do this. And, I think it is sort of this, world marketplace of innovation that we know we have to benefit from. As Richard Danzig said in BioNext this morning, we don't control a lot of these technologies anymore. They're really, the Defense Department has to rely in some part on the international community or the communities around us. And one need only look at the sequencing power of China, which runs most of the sequencing that's done around the world now. So we have some real issues, I think, on the forefront here, where the academies and national security are going to have to work out just how is this done, and done in a way that protects our borders.
Right. So let me steer one to Stefanie. So let's have a hypothetical scenario. You have a faculty member very eager to work with DARPA, and based on your knowledge, their topic area isn't exactly a fit, but you want to help them find a way into the agency to refine their ideas. So you gave the example of the folks, who might do at your university the mines or the drilling. what are some of the things a junior faculty member or mid-career faculty member could do to prepare themselves to come get to know DARPA or the agency?
Well, it's going to depend a lot on the person and the topic, obviously, right? So every answer starts with it depends. But typically what I do, and I have the advantage of being at a small enough university that I can get to know every single one of our faculty members. We think about what they're working on. I usually give them some homework, which is to go through the DARPA website, look at the program managers, look at their bios, figure out what they're working on and what they're interested in, and help them construct, sort of an introductory, maybe 3-sentence or less email that can be read on a single screen of your smartphone to see if they can get a conversation started, if they can come by and visit, if they can have a phone call, and just get to the point where they have an opportunity to listen to what the program managers are actually interested in. Because this is what Bill's point is. You need to be able to understand the other side of the problem. And then we've had a few folks who've done this. They've gotten that entree in. They've come in. They've had conversations. I had one young quantum physicist who came back and said she learned more in 2 hours than she would have learned in 9 months of reading solicitations and BAAs, and she was just overflowing with excitement because it had never occurred to her that there were people in that building in Arlington who would actually talk to her and who would talk about their problems and their interests. And so, but the other thing is sometimes, Bill, the timing is just not right.
Yep.
So the other thing I remind people is that DARPA has a very high turnover rate deliberetely. Program managers are not supposed to stay more than 4 or 5 years, which means that if the right person and the right idea isn't there that fits your interest right now, you might try again in a couple of months. Take a look at the new people. I think you guys still post, DARPA still posts the new people list, right? Where you can see the new bios and see who's coming in. And it's, that turnover rate is an extraordinary thing. And so it's the same thing with funding opportunities. DARPA funding opportunities are not wired. They're specifically designed to cast as wide a net for the craziest ideas and most interesting people out there to respond to. But if the last BAA you saw didn't interest you, wait a week, because there'll be another one. And sometimes the connections just come through hearing what the questions are and responding.
One thing Stefanie said, which I would amplify, is buy plane tickets. Go to, I think our campus is very good at NSF and NIH competitive rates. And that's study section driven. You can respond to a BAA, RFP, whatever, and sit back in your university. I think what I've had to do is educate our faculty most that DARPA wants to engage. If you can get that entree, you actually go there and meet these people and talk to them. I think for a lot of our faculty, they didn't understand that, the DARPA program manager is essentially a bit like a venture capitalist. They have the ability to act. They get ideas reviewed, and they're subject matter experts all around that help DARPA program managers do this. But that's pretty foreign to most faculty, that this is an engagement opportunity of your idea. It's not just about a paper exercise. And so I think for our campus, the most successful thing has been buy plane tickets.
Yeah. One framing trick I give to faculty is I'll have faculty members who'll say, my work is in, I'm actually drawing on one of the questions they got asked is, let's say you work in medical image diagnosis and you say, well, I want to solve this problem, medical image diagnosis. Well, DARPA doesn't have a program in medical image diagnosis, but I might be interested in some machine learning idea that you can test in your domain, which is medical image diagnosis. The math problem I might like. The domain I might not care about because the interest is in the math. So this ability to separate the widget from the science or the phenomena that you're going to study. Faculty, I've seen some who come in and it's so tightly bundled and you have to play this little exercise to separate it, and you realize, it's not about the robot, it's about some perception problem or learning problem, right? So understanding what the part of the problem is that somebody might be interested in. You might actually have something, but if you bundle it all together, the program manager won't know, where to engage you in conversation. I want to steer another question to Steve, but based on something that came in on the chat. So you have an advantage as an institution at Georgia Tech because you have this UARC, and it's integrated into the campus. Maryland has one as well. It's not quite as well integrated as GTRI. The two of you, maybe you're working on one. I don't know. Yeah. So how do you engage if you're at a school that maybe doesn't have that facility built in for the translational research? What advice might you give to a faculty member or even administrator to create those bridges if it's not already organically in the institution?
We end up talking to a lot of other universities about how they can have an applied research organization like GTRI. And the place to start is to ask if their faculty tracks are just the traditional academic track, or if there's room within their personnel system to have soft money research faculty. Who, in a lot of our research groups, I mean, we have postdocs and we have engineers who will help maintain the equipment and the system. But one of the things I really valued at my time at Carnegie Mellon University is that a soft money research faculty member had the same really rights and privileges as an academic faculty member in terms of submitting proposals, managing, supervising graduate students in work. And you can kind of create that kind of environment within your university without having a separate organization that does that. So that's really, I think, the place to start. Then you have a cadre of people who their focus is, what in biomedicine we'll call translation, but their focus is really taking the research ideas and helping scale them, prototype them, help get them across the valley of death so it can actually be used in building these systems. So that's, I think, the place to start there. The other thing, and I'll just mention, is that, and if I could just tell a quick story about an experience I had when I was the director of the Georgia Tech Research Institute, and part of my task from the president was to build more meaningful program opportunities with the colleges. So we were geographically present, but we weren't working together as much as we could. And it dawned on me at an event I was at where I was sitting next to the president of the Undergraduate Student Association. And she said, "Oh, you're the director of GTRI. That's the place where all our students go when they can't get a job anyplace else." We try to hire a lot of Georgia Tech students. And I said, why? And she goes, well, the defense problems are so boring compared to what we're doing in the internet world and things like that. So I took that back to my leadership team at GTRI, and I said, we've got to do something here to engage the students. And at that time, the Navy was having a competition program called Blue Dart. And so we talked to the Navy folks, and they were very happy to sponsor a competition to have. And it turns out they did this at other universities too, but student teams that would work on a competition against each other over a fairly short period of time within a semester. And the project that they were given was to, with $75,000, keep a submarine in a harbor, don't allow it to leave for 30 days. And the winning team designed a torpedo out of 8-inch PVC pipe and a little fishing boat that they launched it from, and in a test at Pensacola, they simulated, got 2 kills out of 3 tries, and then the project was classified. But these 20 undergraduate students, 15 of them got so excited by what they were doing on these national security problems that they decided then that they pivoted in their career plans, and they either went to defense contractors or we were able to hire some of them at GTRI.
Wow.
What that did, we now call these innovation experiments, and we do these for the companies that are located there at Georgia Tech as well. And our provost, who's very enlightened, he's kind of parallel within the position that I held, was a very strong advocate for changing the upper level classes for undergraduates to what we call capstone design. So now our students are expected to work on an industry or a national security problem in a team where we're actually, and my social scientist friends hate when I say soft skills, but besides actually having the experience of taking a project all the way through in a short period of time, there's teamwork, leadership, working on a schedule that are also taught. So, but making the national security problems fun and translating them to the students has been just one of the most exciting things and fun things that I've been able to do in my time at Georgia Tech.
Perfect. Another question that came in on the app is, I don't know if any of us have done this yet. I mean, I've not had the chance at Maryland. How about bringing warfighters or those in the national security arena to campus to talk? There can be issues associated with that. Any experience or advice or ideas as to how to make that more effective?
Yeah, we're actually a very
campus?
veterans-friendly campus, and so we have an Office of Defense Engagement. We just had John Blitch up to talk to us. I know he might have come down to mine. So, yeah, we actually have a lot of engagement. We are actually training medics now in veterinary practices because there's a lot of things going on. So, yeah, we're actually very engaged with defense, the community, and our students have a real awareness. I think that's true in state schools, especially land grants, where there's sort of a civil service mentality. So I think it is a rich ground to continue that kind of communication engagement. And as Steve said, I think this is really important to instill kind of this national security interest and spark in our young students. And we do it a little bit because we have the biodefense, biosecurity mission very much alive amongst us. But and then much like GTRI, we are actually going to visit there soon because we have a Center for Environmental Military Land Management. So we're actually doing a lot of the biodiversity work and remediation work, fire suppression. The natural resource colleges across the U.S. are rich sites for helping the military in a lot of their issues on operational base. So there's a lot of opportunity to engage and instill and incite activity amongst defense in the academic community.
But I imagine it will depend on the university, right? And it will depend on the state, and it depends on the culture. So everyone has to sort of deal with it in a slightly different way. The only thing I would add to that is that I actually reached out to our ROTC department to co-sponsor some of these things. It's very much part of the fabric of the school, and it's a way to kind of get buy-in from the student side as well. So, yeah.
Good. How about one, I think this is one, Stefanie, you and I have dealt with before. So, let's assume this is maybe more to the administrators. You've got problems the university could go after, contribute, but the faculty that you want to engage are booked. They are so productive, they're maxed out. How do you get folks like that to do the overload, if you will, or take on stuff that might be more, in some sense, relentless than the projects they currently have? You have any advice there that might be useful to those administrators in the audience?
That's a really hard question.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big believer that if it's not a problem you care passionately about, it's really hard to get somebody to get up early in the morning and come racing into work and working the long hours if they don't believe in it. So I think the best I would do, aside from offering any financial assistance or incentives to help buy out time and things like that, would be to see if you can get that problem set up in such a way that it becomes something that this faculty member or this group of faculty would be really passionate about. And it comes back to maybe framing that question. If you do this, here is the problem that you can solve. Here is the little piece of the world that you can actually change. But it's a DARPA thing too, right? When one of the challenges you find when you are in the leadership roles at DARPA is there's all these problems that you would love to solve, and you so wish you could just tell a program manager to go take this on. And if they don't love it and if they don't own it, it doesn't matter. It's not going to go anywhere. So fundamentally for me, that was I think it has to be about seeing if the problem is something that they will really internalize and be willing to maybe let some of the other stuff go. And then we can help with the practical aspects of how to keep the other stuff going. But that's my perspective. You probably got much more experience in it.
Well, I'm learning. I'm trying to show people that might be other ways to have more impact, and it might be worth the effort to take on something that is perhaps a little more on the surface difficult because the potential payoff is different than if they keep doing things the way they do. So
there's an aspect of that I saw with our faculty, and I think Ellen mentioned the NSF and the NIH funding, and the kind of the 3-year funding cycles you get in kind of creates a view of research that's a little bit different from DARPA, where you're less willing to look out over the horizon and take a big risk. And so I've been very concerned about a culture potentially evolving at Georgia Tech that would be risk averse in terms of research. And so, and I've, talked to faculty about that who are kind of content with their 3 years of funding, but aren't taking as big a risk as they could. So it's a little bit different play on that, but I always said that one of my jobs was to give permission to take risks. And to try to convince the faculty to do that, because if something didn't work out, I'd take the blame for it. But just, go for it.
Well, it's the top cover issue.
Right,
You provided it.
yeah.
So we're coming to the end of this session. I maybe give everybody a chance to say any concluding remarks. Maybe start with Stefanie and work back this way. Any final comments here?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I just, become part of the DARPA community if you aren't already. I can't say enough about how important universities are to innovation and to the DARPA landscape. It can be one of the most irritating organizations to work with because it is so mission focused and really, really focused on those high risk opportunities. But the payoff to the students, the faculty members, and to the institutions are immense, and ultimately these translate back to the nation. And I encourage you to please keep trying. Everything that we have said is unique to our institutions. I think the thing that I've learned most in the last 7 months is how differently the solution space sort of scales. I work at a medium-sized university. I think you're about 5 times larger, But the core problems are similar. You can talk about them, but you're going to find your own way. And I think the main thing is please keep going, because I don't know, my numbers might not be quite right, but last time I checked, out of the $3-point-something billion budget, close to 20% of that at DARPA went to universities. It's a very, very rich part of the DARPA environment and the DARPA innovation cycle, so keep at it.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that, oftentimes DARPA PMs, it's not really appreciated. Where do they get their ideas? The reality is they're getting ideas from all over the place, and as Stefanie said, and a lot of them are coming from the academies, from the universities. So, if you're able to convince your faculty, it may not, and we've had a few cases of this already, and I've seen it when I was at DARPA, where whole programs get launched on ideas coming in from the university. It's not just an individual project idea. And, that sometimes presents some of its challenges, because a faculty member or a set of faculty member who give an idea to DARPA then expect to get the funding from DARPA for that program idea. And the reality is it can go even farther and involve multi-universities. So, I think the possibilities of scale and impact that you were referring to, Bill, is something that, I try to convince our faculty when they're talking to DARPA, is that, let the risk barriers down. It may be just your idea, but think big and share with DARPA and see where it goes. And so, that's harder for pre-tenure because, the academic environment is still very much department-oriented, led by a tenure process that's, in the 3-year cycle of incremental and publications, which are, exploding. So it's really hard to know. But I think it's really about convincing the faculty who are all really bright. I mean, they're the engine of the universities, that they can make a really big impact if they can buy a plane ticket, go to DARPA and meet a program manager and establish a relationship.
It's just maybe beating a dead horse, but the same thing that my colleague said here. You may feel like you have to force your way into the DARPA community, but you'll be welcomed. And you can't wait for the BAA to be published. You've got to be part of the community that's creating the ideas for that next BAA. And the DARPA program managers are hungry for harvesting these ideas from everybody. There are also many other programs that DARPA supports. We have this DARPA Risers program. There's outreach to get young faculty involved. There's a program, I think, that's still through the Institute of Defense Analysis that DARPA funds, where you're like a fellow of DARPA for a year, and they'll take you around to different military installations and learn about national security problems. People that have done that at Georgia Tech who were just amazed by the hard problems they got insight into and how excited they were about that. Never worked with DARPA before. So taking advantage of all of these situations are really important.
And so I'll just wrap up with a story from last night, actually. I was at the reception for DARPA alumni and realizing that I was a graduate student, funded at a time where the DARPA funds for the Strategic Computing Program set up the entire infrastructure for the kind of work I was doing as a student. And one of the names I came to know at that time was Lynn Conway, who was one of the founders of the whole field of VLSI design, and she was a DARPA program manager in the early 1980s, so she is here at this event. She's, I think, about 80, I don't know. But so I had the chance to meet her, introduce myself, and she said this is such a special event for her because she's getting to see people she hasn't seen in a long time, but it also reminds us all that we're part of something larger than ourselves, that something you do today actually might yield fruit in years, and you don't know what it's going to yield until you step back and have the benefit of time to see it. And I think of things that I was inspired to do as a student where, yeah, maybe I didn't get funded that next BAA, but 10 years later, I realized my thinking has been shaped by this engagement in problems that matter, problems that are brought to me by the program managers. So I urge all of you, same way I think everybody else has, that if you want to be involved in this community, whether it's DARPA that's funding you or some other national security program across the government, that ability to plant seeds that lead to really big harvests down the road. Don't dwell on the immediate. You have to see this, in the 60-year time horizon view of things. So again, I wanted to thank my colleagues, Alan, Steve, and Stefanie for being here. It's been a privilege. Thank you for tolerating my voice, and I look forward to talking to you all throughout the rest of the event.